Welcome to American History Lesson 1. Events leading to the populating of the Americas. Our lesson objectives are: describe the importance of historiography, which includes how historical knowledge is obtained and transmitted when interpreting events in history. Use research and inquiry skills to analyze American history using primary and secondary sources. Understand and explain how the Americas were populated. Understand and explain how events in one region of the world affect other regions of the world. During the last ice age, ocean water froze and became glaciers. These glaciers were responsible for lowering sea levels and creating a bridge of frozen land between Asia and Alaska, now called the Bering Strait. As far back as 40,000 years ago, people first crossed that bridge and traveled from Asia to the Americas. The Ice Age ended about 30,000 years later, melting the glaciers which caused sea levels to rise and flood the Bering Strait. The change in climates meant the land could no longer support large animals, and they began to disappear. People adapted by starting to hunt smaller animals and explore alternative food options. Soon, food supplies were found by fishing and gathering nuts and berries. Over time, mass migration would have people settling North, Central, and South America. Between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, people began cultivating farmland in central Mexico. The first crop grown was maize, or corn, but over time they began cultivating other crops. Farming would spread throughout the Americas, and where farming was especially profitable, people began building permanent settlements. The creation of farmlands meant people stayed in one place longer, and this allowed them to establish more complex societies. The Olmec civilization began in Mexico around 1000 BC and was followed by the Mayas. During AD 1200s, the Aztecs controlled central Mexico and would be in control until European invasion. Around AD 1400, the Incas created a rich empire located in South America. Each of these cultures built large cities and created religious and trade centers. The Hohokam and Anasazi people created civilizations in southwestern North America by about AD 200 to 300. East of the Mississippi River, the cultures were named mound builders due to large burial mounds they created, and several can be found today. Native Americans. To survive in the different environments where they lived, Native Americans developed different lifestyles. Along the coast of central California, the Kashaya Pomo's primary food source was water birds. The Kwakiutl and other peoples of the Northwest relied upon hunting the sea whale, seal, and salmon for their diets. The Pueblo and Hopi tribes of the American Southwest built their homes from adobe, which was baked mud. When a group of people lived near a river, they could farm. Native Americans in the eastern half of North America lived in woodlands and hunted game such as turkeys, deer, and bear, while continuing to eat nuts, berries, and fruits. If they lived in the colder climate of the Northeast, they would rely more on hunting than farming, but if they lived in the warmer southeastern climate, they could farm. The Native American groups were different from each other, but they did share some traits. American Indians established trading networks to exchange goods, and if they produced too much of a product, they traded for items they needed. Native Americans believed that land could be used but not owned. Most believed spirits existed in the world and in nature. Some believed there was one spirit as the supreme creator, while others had many spirit deities. Native Americans had strong family ties, and their families included not only the parents and children, but aunts, uncles, and cousins. The elder family members were valued for their knowledge and wisdom. West Africa. The climates of Western Africa influenced the development of societies like that of the Indians in the Americas. Southern Africa was covered by rainforest tropics, while desert sands covered the north. Central Africa had vast savannas or grasslands, which would serve as a meeting point for trade between the tropical southern rainforest and northern desert sands. The south produced gold, ivory, dyed cloth, and slaves. The north produced salt and manufactured goods and brought a new religion known as Islam. Traders from Portugal arrived in West Africa by the 1440s, looking to expand their markets. The Portuguese claimed two lands and created large sugarcane plantations by the end of a few decades. The Portuguese brought slaves from the African mainland to work on the plantations. Portuguese created trade routes between Western Africa and Europe. West Africa had three major kingdoms. In the center of Western Africa, the Songhai Empire controlled most of the trade across the Sahara Desert. King Eskia Muhammad turned the city of Timbuktu into a center of learning. Around the delta of the Niger River, the Benin Kingdom was the strongest. The Congo Kingdom was established further down the lower Zaire, now Congo River. Life in West Africa was centered on families who lived in small villages. The older family members were held in high esteem, and each family traced its lineage or ancestry for generations. The peoples of West Africa commonly thought that nature was full of spirits, much like the Indians of the Americas, and their religious rituals were prevalent in everyday life. Unlike the Indians of the Americas, the people of Western Africa believed in the collective ownership of land. That meant that everyone in the society had ownership of the land and was responsible for maintaining it. The tasks were divided by age and social rank. Many Western African societies did own slaves, and the slave trade was a vital part of the African trading network. Slave shackles. In the 15th century, decades before they arrived in the Caribbean, Spanish merchants and explorers had already conquered and forced the people of the Canary Islands in the eastern Atlantic Ocean into slavery. On the western coast of Africa, the Portuguese cultivated a slavery-based economic policy with the aid of the African slave markets. This legacy of conquest and slavery shaped the colonization of Puerto Rico and other islands in the Caribbean. Some of the first encounters between Europeans, Indians, and Africans took place in Puerto Rico, and its early history of genocidal violence and physical exploitation was repeated throughout the Americas. Europe. European societies were structured according to rank. Monarchs and nobles owned the land as well as held most of the wealth and power. Beneath the monarchs and nobles was a growing middle class, which included merchants and artisans. The lowest class, the largest class, consisting of peasants who raised crops and livestock. The Roman Catholic Church was a major influence on every level of Western European society. The Church encouraged Christians to reclaim Spain from the Muslims and drive out Muslims from the Holy Land. A series of wars known as the Crusades were fought to drive out the Muslims and served to strengthen the power of the European monarchs. These wars caused an increase in trade. With the increase of trade and new ideas, the power of the Church weakened during this time. The Protestant Reformation of the 1500s resulted in the splintering of the Catholic Church into several different churches. Other changes swept through Europe. The death toll of the 1300s was in the millions. This was a result of crop failure producing famines, rampant diseases, and the wars fought against invaders from the east and each other. The European economy rebounded, though, and the desire for the goods of Asia, especially spices, revived trade and generated more wealth. The population steadily increased, and this resulted in an increase in trade as well. Merchants became wealthier and national monarchs became more powerful, but this was at the expense of nobles losing power and influence. The Renaissance movement began to place value on people as individuals, and their genius and people began to desire fame for themselves. The invention and development of the printing press helped to encourage this by making ideas accessible to a much larger audience than in the past. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The wave of change to hit Europe, as well as advances in sailing technology, started a renewed interest in exploration. Europeans wanted to find new routes to the east to avoid the long journey through Muslim-controlled land. By the 1480s, the Portuguese had sailed around Africa and arrived in India. Christopher Columbus managed to convince Spain's Queen Isabella to fund his attempt to try to find another route to the east by sailing west. Columbus left Spain for Asia in 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On October 12, 1492, a lookout sighted land. Columbus called the people he encountered Indians, as he believed he had reached Asia. After many voyages, Columbus and other explorers financed by Spain established Spanish settlements throughout Central and South America, as well as isolated forts in North America. Fun facts: Christopher Columbus's name wasn't truly his name, but is an anglicization of his real name, Cristoforo Colombo. Columbus became convinced of the possibility of reaching Asia by traveling west, but getting the funding was near impossible in Europe. He tried to get support from many sources, including the King of Portugal, France, and his birth kingdom of Genoa, but most European rulers thought he was delusional. Columbus hung around the Spanish court for years, hoping to convince the Spanish monarchy to finance his journey. Columbus had just given up and was headed to France in 1492 when he got the news that his voyage had finally been approved. The Spanish were terrible to the Native Americans. They killed many and enslaved the survivors. Native Americans fell victim to new diseases introduced by the European explorers. The Native Americans had no immunity to smallpox, measles, mumps, or other diseases. Because of this, hundreds of thousands of them died. The Spanish needed a new source of slave labor, so they began importing West Africans to serve as slaves. From the early 1500s to the early 1800s, 10 to 12 million West Africans were brought to the New World to work as slaves for their colonial masters. The Columbian Exchange is the name for the contact between the Old and the New World that brought about so much change. The Americans introduced crops such as cassava, corn, tomatoes, and potatoes to the Old World markets. Europeans brought coffee, sugar, bananas, horses, cattle, and sheep to their new homes. These changes transformed life for people in both regions for centuries to come. The millions of Native Americans that died from either disease or warfare were soon replaced by millions of Europeans and Africans that arrived in the Americas. Astrolabe. The astrolabe is an astronomical calculating device used from ancient times into the 18th century. Measuring the height of a star using the back of the instrument and knowing the latitude, one could find the time of night and the position of other stars. The open-work piece on the front, called the rete, is a star map of the northern sky. Pointers on the rete correspond to stars. The outermost circle is the Tropic of Capricorn, and the circle that is off-center represents the zodiac, the apparent annual motion of the sun. Engraved plates that fit below the rete have scales of altitude and azimuth, arc of the horizon, for specific latitudes. This brass astrolabe has 4 plates. One may well be a replacement. It was made in Nuremberg by George Hartmann in 1537. An inscription on the inside of the instrument states that it once belonged to the Italian mathematician and astronomer Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642. Further study. Explore this resource from the Smithsonian collection that traces the influence of exploration on the seas on our civilization through the years. This is a large resource collection of several web pages. Be sure to click on each page. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submissions should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname, and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.